Okay, so Greenland, right. You think about it and what comes to mind?
Yeah.
This huge, icy kind of expanse, right? Up there at the top of the world.
Yeah, definitely. It's kind of the classic image.
Exactly. But what's really wild is, well, how long people have actually lived
Oh,
there.
absolutely.
And not just survive, but really thrive there in this really dramatic landscape. So we're going to dive into Greenland's history today. And we're looking at everything from like ancient tools to modern geopolitics
Hmm.
to see what we can uncover. It's a way more interesting story than you might think.
I think a lot of people might be surprised. Yeah, it really shows how adaptable humans are to keep pushing into these really challenging environments and making a life there.
Totally. So in this deep dive, we're not just doing a simple timeline.
No, no, no.
We're going way, way back. I mean, all the way back to the first Paleo-Inuit cultures, like 2500 BCE.
Wow.
And we're bringing it up to the present day with Greenland's kind of unique position of the Kingdom of Denmark and all the current global focus on the Arctic.
Right. Everyone's looking at the Arctic now.
Exactly. And all the sources we've got for this deep dive, they give us this amazing perspective
Hmm.
on what it actually takes to live and adapt
Yeah.
in such an extreme environment.
It makes you wonder, what were they thinking?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, setting out into the unknown like that.
Right.
So let's start at the very beginning. Who were these first people, the pioneers, I guess you could call them, who called Greenland home?
Well, based on what the archaeologists have found, it seems the very first people arrived around 2500 BCE. They probably migrated over from continental North America.
Okay, so basically Canada as we know it today.
Right. And from this early period, there's actually evidence of two distinct cultures. There's the Saquat culture, which was mostly in the west of Greenland from, let's say, 2500 to 800 BCE.
Got it.
And then you've got the Independence Eye culture, which was up north, around 2400 to 1300 BCE.
Wow, so they overlapped a bit.
They did, and what's really fascinating is that these two cultures, they likely came from different waves of migration out of Nunavut in Canada. So even in those early days, it seems like different groups were finding their way to Greenland.
So already a kind of diverse start, two separate groups, each with their own story, I guess.
Exactly. And I think this really highlights that human drive to explore and push boundaries, even in the most challenging places. I mean, they were setting the stage for thousands of years of human presence in Greenland.
Wow, yeah. Okay, so we've got these two groups settling in those early years. What happens next? Do these settlements grow and evolve or?
Well, up north, after the Independence Eye culture, you see the Independence II culture starting up. Around 800 BCE, it was in the same area.
Okay, so a bit of continuity there.
Right. And for a while, archaeologists thought that the early Dorset culture, which appeared around 700 BCE and lasted until about 1 CE, directly followed Independence II.
Okay, so kind of a new group taking over.
Yeah, that was the initial thinking. But newer research suggests it might be more accurate to see the Dorset culture in Greenland as a continuation of Independence difficult, or like an evolution. Some even call them Greenlandic Dorset.
Ah, I see. So maybe not so much a new group, but a change in the existing one, adapting maybe.
Exactly. And their artifacts, things like tools, carvings, and remains of their dwellings have been found over a pretty wide area, from Inglefield Land, way up in the northwest, to Dove Bay on the northeast coast. So they were spread out quite a bit.
Wow, yeah, that's a good chunk of the island. Okay, so it's looking more like cultural shifts happening within these existing groups, in some places at least, but then there's a kind of a gap in the story, isn't there?
You're right. There seems to be a period when Greenland wasn't continuously inhabited. After the early Dorset, things go quiet for a while.
Interesting. Like everybody just packed up and left.
Well, we're not entirely sure what happened. But then, around 700 CE, a new group shows up. The late Dorset people. They settled in the north, and they were there for quite a while until around 1300. So for a good few centuries, they were the main people living in Greenland, at least in the north, until this totally different group arrived from across the ocean.
A Norse.
Exactly.
And that's around 980 CE, right? A huge turning point for Greenland. But how did they even know Greenland existed? I mean, it's not exactly next door to Norway or Iceland.
Well, European awareness probably starts in the late 9th century. There's this Icelandic explorer, Gunnbjörn Olfsson, who gets blown off course sailing between Norway and Iceland. And he's said to have seen some islands off the coast of Greenland.
Okay, so a bit of accidental exploration there.
Right. But the real push for exploration and settlement comes a bit later, in the 980s, with Eric the Red.
Ah, Eric the Red. Now that's a name everyone's heard.
He's a bit of a legend. So Eric leads these expeditions from Iceland and reaches the southwest coast of Greenland.
And this is where the name Greenland comes from, right? Like,
Yay.
to attract settlers, he gives it this enticing name. Clever marketing even back then.
Yeah, that's what the sagas say, like the Book of Icelanders and the Saga of Eric the Red. They credit him with that idea. You see, Eric was actually exiled from Iceland for murder around 982, and he spent his 3 years of exile exploring Greenland's southwestern fjords.
Okay, so exile leads to discovery. Interesting.
Right, and when he gets back to Iceland, he supposedly said a good name would get more people interested in going there. And surprisingly, it seems to have worked. The sagas tell us 25 ships left Iceland with Eric in 985, although only 14 are thought to have actually made it to Greenland. And archaeological finds at the first known settlement, Brattahlid, support a timeline around the year 1000, so it seems likely a Norse presence was established around then.
14 ships. It's a serious commitment for that time.
Uh,
Where did these Norse settlers actually choose to live, and what was life like for them, this new northern world?
They mostly settled along the southwestern coast. Along those sheltered fjords, some think that those areas might have been a little bit more, well, hospitable back then, maybe with more vegetation and things. They cleared the land for building, of course, and for grazing their livestock. They brought cattle, sheep, and goats with them. So their economy was a mix of this pastoral farming and hunting. They hunted local animals like caribou and seals. And there's also evidence that groups, or even individual farmers, would travel much further north in the summer, all the way to the Disco Bay area, to hunt for really valuable animals, like walruses, narwhals, and...
Polar bears. Wait, they hunted polar bears. That's incredibly dangerous.
Oh, absolutely. It would have been incredibly risky. But the rewards could be great. They were mainly after their skins and hides, and especially their ivory. Walrus ivory in particular became essential for the Norse Greenlanders. It was kind of like their currency, and it was also their main export. They traded this ivory, along with other stuff, things like rope they made from animal hides, sheep, sealskins, wool, cattle hides with Europe. And in return, they got crucial supplies like iron tools for farming and building, wood too. Especially important for sheep building because Greenland didn't have a lot of trees, and they'd also get food supplies. And this trade really helped them maintain their religious and social connections with the broader Norse world.
So it wasn't just a matter of survival, but also staying connected to their culture and beliefs.
Right, exactly. Initially, this trade was mostly with Iceland and Norway. But later, laws were made that said all ships going to and from Greenland had to sail directly to Norway. And then, in 1126, a diocese was established at Geirair under the Norwegian Archdiocese, so those cultural and religious ties were really strengthened.
Wow, so a full-fledged Arctic trade network operating way back then. Fascinating. And how big did these settlements actually get? How many people were we talking about?
Well, the estimates for the peak Norse population in Greenland vary. But current thinking, based on archaeology and historical records, suggests somewhere between 2,000 and maybe even 10,000 people. And those people were spread across 3 main settlement areas.
Okay.
Archaeologists have found the remains of something like 620 farms in those areas. The biggest was the eastern settlement, with about 500 farms. It was down at the southern tip of Greenland. Then there was the western settlement, which was smaller, with about 95 farms, further up the west coast. And lastly, the middle settlement, very small with about 20 farms. It's often considered an extension of the eastern settlement.
So a decent amount of farms spread out across quite a difficult landscape, really. But we know it doesn't last forever, right? Eventually the settlements disappear. When did things start to go downhill for them?
It seems like the decline started in the 14th century. After a few hundred years of relative success, they started to struggle. There are a few key events we can point to. In 1355, King Magnus V of Norway and Sweden sent some ships to check on the western and eastern settlements, and they found both were still entirely Norse and Christian. So things seemed okay at that point. But then in 1369, the Groenlands, nor the main ship for the Greenland trade, sank, and it wasn't replaced. This really messed up their access to vital goods and communication.
Yeah, losing that connection would be a huge blow.
Exactly. And then sometime before 1400, the western settlement is abandoned. And by 1378, there's no longer a bishop at Geirair, which might point to a declining population and weaker ties with Europe. So a gradual decline, for sure. But there are also these dramatic accounts, stories of attacks, for example, like the one by the Skraeling.
Right, the Skrellings. That term always seemed a bit, well, not very respectful, I guess.
Yeah, it's definitely not a term we'd use today. It was the Norse term for the indigenous people they encountered. Most likely the Thule people, who are the ancestors of the modern Inuit.
Okay, so possible conflict with the Inuit.
It's possible, but the evidence is mixed. One Icelandic source from 1379 mentions an attack on the eastern settlement. It claims 18 men were killed and 2 boys were taken. But a lot of historians question the accuracy of that account. Some suggest it might actually describe a conflict with the Sami people in Scandinavia, or a pirate raid on Iceland. And then there's a church document from 1418 that also talks about an attack, and some think it was by the Inuit. But historian Jack Forbes, he has this theory that it's actually referring to an attack on Norse settlers in northern Norway.
Wait, so there were Norse settlements in Norway that were also called Greenland? That's confusing.
Yeah, it does complicate things, and it might explain the confusion in the historical records. But the really important thing is that despite these written accounts of attacks, there's no real archaeological evidence to back them up. No signs of battles or massacres, nothing conclusive. So the idea that the Norse were violently driven out, it's not very strong.
That's a crucial point, the lack of archaeological evidence. So if not a violent end, what's the last clear sign we have of them? When do they just vanish from the historical record?
The last undisputed written record is a marriage that took place in 1408 at Hovalsi Church. The ruins are actually still standing today. Pretty well preserved, too. There's also correspondence from that year between the Pope and the Bishop of Gerar. After that, mentions of the Norse settlements get really, really scarce.
So that's like the 15th century.
Yeah, right. The Danish cartographer Claudius Clavis might have visited around 1420. We're not totally sure. We base it on some later maps and documents. And then there's a letter from Pope Nicholas V in 1448. He mentions an attack by heathens in Greenland about 30 years earlier, but even he admits he doesn't know the details. So a lot of uncertainty. But most historians agree that the eastern settlement was probably gone by the mid-15th century.
And what about that story of a European ship finding a Norse corpse in the 1540s?
Yeah, there is that account. A ship lands in the eastern settlement and finds the unburied body of a Norseman. Might be the last time a European saw a Norse Greenlander. Sort of a sad image, really. The last man standing.
Wow, that's powerful. The lone survivor. So we've got all these different clues, the climate changing, the trade declining, maybe some conflict. But what's the leading theory today? What ultimately made these settlements that lasted for centuries just disappear?
It's probably a combination of things, all coming together. Environmental damage over centuries. Climate change, the Little Ice Age, which started around 1300 and got worse by 1420. Colder temperatures, more sea ice, and maybe some conflict with the Inuit, although, as we said, the evidence is thin. Plus, they were losing contact with Europe, and that crucial support was drying up.
Isolation can really make things tough.
Absolutely. And then there's also the possibility that they were just too stuck in their ways, not adapting enough to a changing Arctic. And back in Europe, things were changing too. There were opportunities there, especially after the plagues. And on top of all that, the value of walrus ivory was dropping. And that was their main export, remember?
It was their lifeline, their economic engine.
Exactly. Now, historian Kirsten Seaver, she argues in her book, The Frozen Echo, that the colony might have been doing better than we think towards the end. She suggests there could have been undocumented attacks or even immigration.
People choosing to leave, to go back, or somewhere else.
Possibly. But the archaeological evidence from most of the Norse farms suggests they were abandoned in an orderly way. People took their valuable stuff with them. But the evidence also shows their diet was getting worse and worse. And a big factor in that decline was probably the rise of both Russian and African ivory in European markets. It drove the price of walrus ivory way down.
So Greenland's economy was hit by events happening thousands of miles away. Globalization, even back then.
Exactly. So you've got these environmental pressures, economic shifts, and maybe a bit of isolation. And of course, Greenland itself was never an easy place to live, was it?
Not exactly a walk in the park, no.
From the start, it presented bigger challenges than, say, Iceland or Norway. Harsher winters, less land that was good for farming. And studies of ancient pollen, actually, show signs of soil erosion and deforestation, probably made worse by Norse farming practices. So as the land became less productive, they relied more and more on raising livestock, and then eventually even more on hunting. But here's the thing, they never really adopted the Inuit way of hunting, especially the whole kayak thing and the way they hunted ringed seals. And those were crucial skills for surviving in that environment.
So even though they were surrounded by people who were experts at living in the Arctic, they stuck with their own ways. Stubborn, I guess, or maybe just not wanting to change.
Could be. And it's a shame because those skills could have made a difference. And then you've got the climate getting colder. Ice core samples show that around 1200, the medieval warm period ends and the Little Ice Age kicks in, and we can see the effects of that in the animal bones they left behind. A shift from cows and pigs to more sheep and goats. And by the 14th century, marine food was making up something like 80% of their diet, so they were depending more and more on the sea to survive.
And all this time, the Thule people, the ancestors of the modern Inuit, are living in Greenland too. They arrive around the 12th century, right? Did the Norse and the Thule ever interact?
They did, though the historical sources are a bit patchy. We know the Norse called them Skrælings, as we said, and archaeology shows there was at least some trade between the two groups. Norse metal items have been found in Inuit sites and vice versa, so there was some exchange going on.
Makes sense. I mean, living so close together.
Right. And the historian Magnus Magnusson, he actually thought the relationship was mostly positive. He even called it a deep friendship. But even if there was some cooperation, the Norse, for the most part, stuck to their own way of life. They didn't fully adopt Inuit survival techniques. And by 1300, the Thule people had expanded their winter settlements closer to the Norse. And remember, the Western settlement is abandoned around 1350.
So maybe there's some pressure there too.
Possibly. And contact with Europe was becoming less and less frequent, although it continued into the early 15th century. But the Norwegian crown had a monopoly on shipping, and that might have made it harder for the Norse to get essential supplies, like timber. Still, even with all the hardship, it seems they held on to their Christian faith and European customs, even into the 15th century. Though there are records showing that they were really struggling. A papal exemption from paying tithes was given in 1345 because they were so poor. And that last documented ship in 1406-1410, it brought news from Europe and likely took some people back to Norway. But after that, silence. The curtain falls on the Norse-Greenland saga.
And that's where the genetic research comes in, right? Looking at the DNA of modern Inuit populations, what does that tell us about how these two groups interacted?
Yeah, the genetic studies are really interesting. They've found that a significant percentage of men in Western Greenland, something like 40 to 60%, have Northwestern European Y-DNA haplogroups.
Wow, it's pretty high.
It is, and it suggests there was intermixing between Norse men and Inuit women, but there's no sign of European female mitochondrial DNA in those populations. So it seems like the gene flow is mainly one way.
Fascinating. It gives us a glimpse into how those two cultures were mingling and how those interactions shaped the genetic makeup of the population. Okay, so the Norse story ends, and the Inuit are the main people in Greenland for centuries. And then in the 18th century, Denmark comes back into the picture. What brings them back to Greenland?
Well, after the Norse settlements were abandoned, a lot of the knowledge about them was lost, and the climate was getting worse with the Little Ice Age. It made navigating harder, and there was a lot of confusion about Greenland's geography. But European powers like Denmark, Norway, and England were still interested in the Arctic, mainly because they were looking for a northwest passage to connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans.
That was the big dream for a long time, right?
Yeah.
Shortcut to the east.
Exactly. By 1502, the southern coast of Greenland was roughly charted on some maps. And then in 1578, the English explorer Martin Frobisher rediscovers Greenland.
Rediscover. Interesting way to put it.
Yeah, it's like they'd forgotten about it for a while. And after that, Danish and English whaling in the waters around Greenland starts to pick up. The western coast becomes known as Davis Strait, named after John Davis, another English explorer. And then there's this symbolic thing in the 1660s. The Greenlandic polar bear gets added to the Denmark-Norway coat of arms, maybe as a statement of their claim, or maybe to protest all the foreign whaling.
So exploration, resource extraction, and a bit of symbolic posturing. Classic.
Oh.
And then along comes Hans Ade in 1721. What's his goal?
Well, Hans Ade was a Norwegian Lutheran clergyman, and at first he really wants to find the descendants of those old Norse settlers. He figures they're still there and that they've lost their faith over time, so he sets out to reconnect with them and bring them back to Christianity. But when he gets to Greenland, he doesn't find any Norse descendants, just the Inuit.
Oops. So, change of plans?
Yeah, he shifts focus and starts missionary work among the Inuit, and eventually he baptizes a lot of them. And this really marks the beginning of the Danish colonial presence in Greenland. They start setting up trading colonies along the coast, and they establish a royal trade monopoly.
Okay, so that's a big shift from looking for lost Europeans to setting up a colony and converting the locals.
Yeah, and it wasn't easy. Ade had all sorts of problems. Clashes with Dutch whalers, huge cultural and language barriers. He was trying to convert people whose worldview was completely different. The new settlement of Godthab, which would later become Nuuk, the capital, is founded in 1728. But it was a rough start. Scurvy outbreaks, smallpox, devastating for the local population. Later on, Moravian missionaries arrive, and they actually have more success with converting the Inuit.
Interesting. So different approaches, different outcomes.
Right. Then you have this Danish merchant, Jacob Severin, who ends up taking over the administration. He secretly... Meanwhile, he does a lot of important work. He studies the Kalaalleq language and writes about Greenland. But his attempts to introduce European-style farming, they pretty much fail. The climate and the soil, it's just too different.
So some wins, some losses.
Yeah.
But through it all, Greenland stays under Danish control. Even after Norway gets handed over to Sweden in 1814, then the 19th century rolls around. Does anything change?
Well, Greenland remains a Danish territory, but the 19th century sees growing interest from polar explorers and scientists from all over. The Danish colonial presence keeps expanding along the coast. And in 1861, the first Greenlandic language journal is published.
Wow, that's a big step.
It was a sign of a developing Greenlandic identity. And there's even some Inuit migration from British North America to northern Greenland during this time. On a sadder note, the northeast coast gets hit hard by the eruption of a volcano in Iceland in 1783. It caused widespread environmental damage and depopulation.
Wow, a volcano in Iceland impacting Greenland. That shows how interconnected everything is.
Exactly. But on a more positive note, you start to see the beginnings of local political participation in Greenland. The first democratic elections for district assemblies are held in 1862-1863.
So Greenlanders starting to have a voice in their own affairs.
Right. And then, of course, there's Fridtjof Nansen, the famous Norwegian explorer. He makes the first crossing of the Greenland ice sheet in 1888, and that brings even more scientific attention to the island. And all of this leads to the establishment of separate local councils, or landstings, for northern and southern Greenland in 1911. So you've got this gradual movement toward more local control, and then the 20th century hits and things really start to change. Greenland suddenly becomes very strategically important.
The world is changing, technology is changing, and suddenly Greenland's location isn't so remote anymore.
Exactly. American explorers, guys like Robert Peary, are finally figuring out the true size of Greenland, and that leads to some U.S. territorial claims, at least at first. But those are dropped after the U.S. buys the Virgin Islands from Denmark in 1917.
Smart move by Denmark, I guess.
Yeah, probably. But then Norway becomes independent again in 1905, and they've got their eyes on Greenland too. It leads to Norway actually occupying parts of eastern Greenland in 1931.
Things are heating up.
Yeah, things get tense. But eventually it goes to the Permanent Court of International Justice, and they rule in favor of Denmark in 1933.
So Denmark holds on. But then World War II breaks out, and things get really complicated.
Oh, yeah. Denmark gets occupied by the Nazis in 1940, and suddenly Greenland is super important to both sides for air bases, weather stations, potential military stuff. And since Denmark's government is basically out of commission, the Danish minister to the U.S., Henrik Kaufmann, he makes a deal with the U.S. in 1941. He allows them to set up military bases in Greenland.
Wow, a solo act. Making deals for a whole country. Bold move.
It was, but it kind of works out. Greenland becomes closely connected to the U.S., and they build 14 American bases on the island. And during the war, Greenland has this almost independent status. It's pretty unique.
So Greenland's caught up in this global conflict.
Yeah, and there's even more. The Germans try to set up secret weather stations in Greenland. And in response, this group called the Sledge Patrol is formed. It's made up of local Greenlanders and Danes, and they patrol this massive coastline. It's an incredible story.
Sounds like a movie.
It really does. And even after the war ends, Greenland stays strategically important. Even more so, in fact, because of the Cold War.
The stakes are higher than ever.
Right. Now it's all about monitoring the Soviets, their military activity, and especially their potential ICBM routes. The U.S. even offers to buy Greenland from Denmark. Straight up, that's how important it was to them. And in 1951, they replaced that 1941 treaty with a new one that sets up Thule Air Base permanently in northwest Greenland.
Thule, that name comes up a lot in discussions Greenland.
Yeah, it's a key location. Unfortunately, setting up Thule meant relocating Inuit families in 1953, a really dark chapter. And then there's the 1968 B-52 crash. A U.S. bomber carrying nukes crashes near Thule. It was a huge scandal called Thulic. It just showed how risky all this was.
Yeah, having nukes flying overhead. Not exactly reassuring for the locals.
No, not at all. And throughout the Cold War, the U.S. kept upgrading their ballistic missile early warning system at Thule. Meanwhile, back on the ground, Greenland's going through rapid urbanization. People are moving from small settlements to bigger towns.
Progress, but at a cost.
Exactly. It was supposed to modernize the country, but it caused social problems. Unemployment, bad housing.
And I bet those Danish subsidies weren't enough to solve everything.
Nope. And there was a shortage of Greenlandic professionals, teachers, doctors, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Then in 1982, TV arrives in Greenland. So now they're even more connected to the wider world. But the economy faces new challenges. The cod fisheries collapse, some mines close. So Greenland becomes even more dependent on Danish aid and shrimp exports.
So a lot of changes happening, both good and bad. And in the middle of all this, there's a growing movement for self-determination, right?
Right. One of the big turning points was in 1973. Greenland gets pulled into the European Economic Community along with Denmark.
The EEC, the forerunner of the European Union.
Exactly. And the Greenlanders, they weren't happy about it. They didn't want to be part of it.
So not exactly feeling the European love.
Not really. And this really fuels the desire for more control over their own affairs. It all culminates in 1979. Denmark grants Greenland home rule.
A big moment.
Huge. And then in 1985, they vote to leave the EEC, which they do.
Wow. Talk about taking control.
Yeah, they weren't messing around. And that withdrawal was formalized with the Greenland Treaty.
So starting in 1979, they really start charting their own course.
Yeah. And it's been all about Greenlandization. In 1979, they renamed the capital from Godthaab to Nuuk, back to its Greenlandic name. Then in 1985, they get their own flag. And in 1986, the Royal Greenland Trading Department, that old monopoly, it gets transferred to local control. They call it Kalalit Nurfiat, or KNIAS. And after the 2008 referendum, their powers are expanded even further.
They're taking back their own institutions and identity.
Exactly. And in 2009, Danish is dropped as an official language. Kalaallisut is now the main language. They're also becoming more active internationally. They join the Arctic Council and other important organizations. But the U.S. military bases are still there, particularly Thule. That's an ongoing discussion.
Right. And then there was that whole thing with Donald Trump wanting to buy Greenland back in 2025.
Yeah, that was a wild one. Denmark, of course, said, no way.
So from the first humans arriving thousands of years ago to this complicated relationship with Denmark to global politics, Greenland's history is just incredible. It's really a story of survival and change against some pretty tough odds.
It really is. We've seen the rise and fall of the Norse, the Danish colonization, how important Greenland became in the 20th century, and now this push for self-determination. It's all about adaptation, resilience, and the forces of environment, culture, and geopolitics all colliding.
And it makes you wonder, what's next for Greenland? What's the next chapter in this story? What does their future hold with the Arctic changing so fast and the world watching? A lot to think about for sure.
Definitely.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Greenland's history. It's been fascinating.
My pleasure.
We'll see you next time for another deep dive into, who knows? History's full of surprises.
That it is.
Yeah.